Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and this is your year-ahead horoscope forecast for the zodiac sign of Sagittarius for the entire year of 2022. If you're new to my channel, then my name is Chris Brennan, and I'm the host of the Astrology podcast and the author of a book on ancient astrology titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune. So in my approach, I synthesize a little bit of ancient and a little bit of modern astrology in order to get the best of both worlds. So each week I release new podcasts and videos on astrology on my channel. So if you'd like to get notifications when I release a new video, then please hit the subscribe button here on YouTube. And if you enjoy this video, then please consider hitting the like button to show me that you enjoyed the content and you'd like to see more of it. Okay, so my horoscopes are primarily meant to be read relative to your rising sign or your ascendant sign, which are essentially the same things. Although you can also watch them from the perspective of your sun sign, especially if you're born during the day, or your moon sign, especially if you're born at night. So the rising sign changes signs every hour or two during the course of the day, whereas the moon sign takes about 2 days to change signs, and the sun sign takes about a month to change signs. So as a result of that, the rising sign is much more personally relevant to you, and for that reason, I would really focus on that when you're looking at these horoscopes, or horoscopes in general for that matter. So if you don't know what your rising sign is, then all you need to do is find out your birth time and then go to a website where you can get your birth chart calculated, such as astro.com, and you should be able to get your ascendant or your birth rising sign calculated on those websites. So I have a video tutorial titled How to Calculate Your Ascendant and Rising Sign on my channel, which you can either search for or I'll put a link to it in the upper corner of this video right here. So let me know in the comments below what your sun, moon, and rising signs are, and which sign resonates with you more when you watch your video horoscopes like this one. Alright, Sagittarius, you lovable goofballs, let's jump into your transits for 2022 and see what the stars have in store for you. So here's a transit chart that shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the year and where they will end up by the end of the year. So I want to start by talking about the Venus retrograde transit in Capricorn in your second house of finances, which actually started late last year in December of 2021 when Venus went retrograde in the sign of Capricorn later in the month, conjunct Pluto. But this transit is actually going to continue on into the first couple of months of 2022 because it's not until March 6th, actually, that Venus finally leaves Capricorn and exits your second house when it moves into Aquarius. So as a result of that, we're going to continue to see a lot of activity connected with this Venus retrograde transit all the way through early March. So the second house is the house of finances, possessions, and income. Here it is in the transit chart. There's second house, there's Venus. Venus is going retrograde, which means it's doing a U-turn and then walking backwards through your second house before it eventually stations direct and starts going forward. That looks kind of messy, so I'm going to clean that up a little bit. There we go. So Venus retrogrades in your second house. For some of you, especially those of you with night charts, this can be a relatively positive period when it comes to financial matters, where you could see an increase of income, or you could go back and start rethinking things and renegotiating some of your social relationships in a way that you figure out how to make more money or increase your income in some way. So for some of you, this could be a little bit intense, especially for those of you with day charts, because Venus stationed retrograde conjunct the planet Pluto. And Pluto can be kind of an intense planet that can indicate issues surrounding control, power plays, manipulation. It can also represent sometimes the sort of darker aspects of society or the sort of metaphorical underworld in some way. So somehow some of these financial matters may be wrapped up in that, which could be a little tricky to navigate. But for some of you, especially those of you with night charts, if you navigate it successfully, it could indicate revising this part of your life in order to increase your assets and just come into a better sense of earning power financially during this time. There could be some relationship things surrounding money, or relationship issues surrounding money that you might want to be careful about, because there can be issues of control and manipulation involving your finances. So you might want to be a little bit careful about that in terms of the conjunction with Pluto. Additionally, in late January, the planet Mars is going to ingress into the sign of Capricorn on January 24th. And that's going to stay there for about a month, all the way until March 6th. So when Mars goes into Capricorn, on the one hand, this can be a period of increased focus and activity where you're much more just energized and focused on doing what it takes in order to increase your income. Sometimes it means you have to work harder and put in longer hours during this time in order to make more money. But in the end, it can pay off as long as you get in and do the work during this time. So that's the positive side of the transit, especially for those of you with night charts. For those of you with day charts, Mars transits can sometimes be a little bit more tricky and a little bit more challenging, because Mars, it can heat things up and make things move faster so that the pace of things quickens. But it can also be an irritating or inflaming sort of signification or influence, quote unquote, as well, which can bring things like strife or fighting or conflict, or even severing and separation when it comes to financial matters. So you might want to be careful about conflict or fighting over financial matters. Be careful, because traditionally Mars in the second house can be one of the traditional associations of like a drop in income or a loss of money through things like theft, or in some instances, for example, when people have Mars prominently placed in the second house natally, it can indicate people who spend money too impulsively or too freely and end up putting themselves in a bad financial situation as a result of expenditures. So there's a whole range of scenarios for that. So don't necessarily want to freak anyone out, because there's the constructive end of the spectrum, which could be just like putting more money into more energy into making money. And there's the negative end of the spectrum that could be having some major conflict involving your finances during this 1 month period. But it's just good to be aware of that, because it seems like in the first quarter, financial matters are one of the main focuses for you. And so if you're forewarned, then you're sort of forearmed in terms of being able to navigate some of these things more successfully than you might otherwise if you were completely caught off guard. All right, so that's one of the initial transits I wanted to talk about. The next one I want to talk about is Jupiter ingressing into the sign of Pisces, which is your fourth house of your home, your family, your living situation, and your private life. So Jupiter's the planet of growth, expansion, optimism, and lots of positive things, basically. And it's going into your fourth house of home and family and living situation, which should be a relatively positive period in terms of your living situation, where you may move to a new place or improve basically your living situation overall at this time. So for some people, that will be getting a new place and sort of moving up in the world in terms of their living situation. For others, it could be something as simple as like remodeling or redecorating, redesigning, or expanding their home in some way. Doing something to improve your living situation during this time would be a great use of this energy, because it's all about just an expansion and improvement of one's private life, since the fourth house is the most hidden part of the chart, opposite to the 10th house, which is one's public life and one's career and overall life direction and reputation. So the focus here is on sort of going within and doing what it takes to improve things in terms of your private life. The other fourth house thing that's relevant is sometimes parents and family. So if you've previously had some challenges in terms of your relationship with your parents, this could be a good period to try to patch things up a little bit or improve that relationship. Or in some instances, Jupiter transits through the fourth house can just be something positive happening in your parents' life, quite independent of you, but that just happens to be reflected in your chart, so that you're seeing an echo of your parents going through a relatively positive time during that period. Now, one thing that we do have to be a little bit careful about is that at one point during this transit, Jupiter is going to catch up to and conjoin the planet Neptune around April 12th. So there it is on the Archetypal Explorer transit graph. It peaks on April 12th when Jupiter conjoins Neptune. So Jupiter's the planet of growth and expansion. Neptune is more of an illusory planet, which indicates illusions. Sometimes it can indicate deception. But generally speaking, it can be a relatively positive influence, which can indicate that you're going through a period where things look kind of ideal. So in terms of your home and living situation, this could be a period where if you have creative impulses, it could be a good period to really redesign things and create your kind of ideal living situation aesthetically. However, one thing I would advise you is if you end up setting some sort of new arrangement in terms of your home and living situation, just be clear to sort of dot all your I's and cross all of your T's when it comes to any contracts or agreements that take place with respect to your home and living situation at this time. That also extends to any arrangements with your parents, because sometimes Neptune transits can be deceptive and there can be things that look one way initially when you walk into it, but then once you really get into it, it turns out that things were quite different than what you were told at the beginning. So be a little bit careful for issues involving deception or things that are misleading or illusory during this time when it comes to your fourth house transits, during the first 4 months or so, especially of this year. All right, so that's one of the Jupiter transits this year. The other Jupiter transit this year is that starting on May 10th, Jupiter is going to depart from Pisces and it's going to move into the sign of Aries and into your fifth house. So the fifth house is one of the more positive houses. It's the house associated with Venus, and in ancient astrology, it's said to be the place of good fortune. So the fifth house is traditionally associated with things like children, both your own children, if you ever have any, as well as just other people's children and the idea of children around you, but also things like creativity, pleasure, and the fifth house also has to do with sex and sexuality, as well as just your orientation towards that topic in general. So Jupiter is the greater benefic. It's the planet of growth and expansion. So typically, a Jupiter transit through the fifth house can indicate a period of growth and expansion and success in these fifth house topics during this time, for especially the second half of the year, because Jupiter is going to be transiting through Aries from about May 10th through October 28th. Then it's going to retrograde out for about a month and then come back from December 20th through May of 2023. So this is really like a two-parter transit, and we're going to get the first half of it this year in 2022 and the second half in 2023. So for those of you that want to have children or planning on having children, having a Jupiter transit go through the fifth house is one of the classic good periods in order to have children in which a person could conceive or have a baby, for example. For those of you that have had maybe any challenges having children or conceiving, this can be a good time to seek sort of treatment with that, or to attempt to have children in terms of there being some periods that are more successful or less successful for those things. So it's a good thing to try or make an attempt for if that's something that you want. Other times, the topic of children can just become more important in some ways in your life. For example, if you work with children as part of your work, and it can be a relatively positive period. I know, for example, there's a children's book author that has a stellium in the fifth house, so the topic of children partially manifests through her work of writing children's books. Other things, creativity. Jupiter transits through the fifth house, if you have any sort of creative or artistic impulses, can be great for creativity and learning new techniques and starting to express yourself more openly when it comes to your art and your creative impulses. So it can be a great period for expressing yourself and initiating new projects in order to do that in a more open and a more large and sort of out there fashion. Finally, the fifth house is the house of sex and sexuality. So in terms of this, it can just be a very pleasant time for sort of like romantic arrangements, different trysts like that, and sort of especially short-term relationships, but generally that which brings you pleasure in life, which can include sexual relationships, but also things like leisurely activities or what you do for fun can be experienced as more prominent or more fun during this time, and you can find more success and sort of relaxation in those things during this part of the year more than other years. So it can be a good thing for all of those, sort of all across the board. All right, so those are the Jupiter transits. Now I want to talk a little bit about the Saturn transits, because we're having the second half of Saturn's transit through the sign of Aquarius, which is your third house, which has to do with communication, siblings, short distance travel, and education. The third house can also indicate your neighborhood, as well as extended family and relatives like aunts and uncles and cousins. So here's your third house, and there's that Saturn transit. So Saturn's been going through your third house. It started, initially it dipped in for just a few months from March or April of 2020, and then it retrograded out, and then it came back about a year ago in December of 2020, and it's been in Aquarius for the past year. So Saturn can bring up some surmountable difficulties or sometimes some obstacles or setbacks when it comes to this area of your life, either pertaining to communication or education or your siblings, or something involving short distance travel like your car or getting around your neighborhood, or sometimes interactions with neighbors or cousins or other relatives. So Saturn transits tend to be a little bit restrictive and can indicate some problems sometimes when in this area. So sometimes these can be surmountable difficulties. So it's like something that comes up that's annoying, that you don't want to deal with, but you're sort of forced to deal with. But if you push through it and you work on it, eventually you come out the other side a little bit stronger as a result. So that's the sort of best case scenario when it comes to this transit, especially for some of you with day charts, where Saturn tends to be more constructive. For those of you with night charts, or if you're experiencing the more challenging part of this transit, sometimes Saturn can put up a roadblock or like a stop sign where it says there's something about this area of your life where you've been doing something, but you cannot proceed further on this path. And instead, you have to just go a different direction and go down another path. And that door has been sort of closed off to you. But one of the things about Saturn transits when it does that is, even though you don't typically see it at the time, usually when Saturn closes one door for you that's in front of you on your path, what it's doing is it's also opening another door that it's forcing you to go down in a different path, but you just can't see it until you get there. So that's my sort of advice about this, where even if Saturn shuts off something in terms of the direction that your life was headed up to this point when it comes to this area, just know that in most instances, it's closing that door so it'll open another. So that can be challenges in the workplace, challenges with siblings, surmountable difficulties when it comes to short distance travel or neighbors or communication or other things like that. But try to identify if it's one of those things that you can push through and it's a surmountable difficulty, or if it's just one of those things that you cannot get through and you have to just sort of take the loss and move forward in another area. That's some of my advice. So that's going to become more acute. Some of the issues with that Saturn transit are going to become more acute, especially in early April when Mars ingresses into Aquarius and makes a conjunction with Saturn in that sign in your third house. So this transit actually begins back on March 6th, as soon as Mars moves into Aquarius, and then it peaks at that time around April 4th and 5th when Mars exactly conjoins Saturn. And then eventually this transit will end April 14th when Mars departs from Aquarius and moves into Pisces. So with Mars transits, it may speed up the pace of communication or other energy that you have to expend when it comes to the third house topics of short distance travel, communication, siblings, neighbors, etc. So there may be more interactions with those people or having to do a lot more things during this time. Sometimes, though, when Mars and Saturn meet up and conjoin, it can feel like two different energies that are pulling you in opposite directions, which can sometimes indicate a period in which there's a lot of tension and a lot of anxiety in this part of your life for a brief period of time, for about a month or a month and a half. In some instances with Mars transits, of course, there can be issues of strife or separation or conflict when it comes to this area. So it could be an area in which Mars going through your third house can make you get into some sort of verbal altercation or some sort of argument with somebody. It could be a sibling, it could be a neighbor, it could be an extended relative. The third house is also the place just generally of communications. So one of the things you want to do is be careful to watch yourself and not say anything impulsively in the heat of the moment that you might regret afterwards, because sometimes that can lead to a major falling out or a separation of somebody in your life that's important to you, including the third house is also one of the places of friendship besides the 11th house. So just try to pay a little bit more attention during this time, not to do anything impulsive that you might regret afterwards. Since the third house is also short distance travel, like driving in your car, that can also be something as simple as, don't speed or do anything impulsive or reckless during this time, because that could result in like getting in an accident or something like that, or getting a ticket, which you might regret later. So running into problems with short distance travel. All right. So the other thing I need to bring up, which is tied in potentially with the Saturn transit, is that we're getting the very last phase of Saturn squaring Uranus this year, especially in the September and October timeframe around the third quarter of 2022. So this is a continuation of a transit that we already had 3 exact passes of in 2021. So it's something that has already been ongoing and has largely played itself out for the most part in our life. But there's going to be one more major wave of this, which occurs in the third quarter around September and October. So I've already talked about Saturn transiting the third house, and it's squaring Uranus, which is in your 6th house of work and health. So it's indicating some sort of potential tension between these two areas of your life, between the sector of your chart that has to do with communication, short distance travel, neighbors, siblings, and this other sector that has to do with work and health matters. So Uranus has been transiting through your 6th house over the past few years now, since I think about 2018 or so, and Uranus transits can sometimes indicate major unexpected changes, radical departures from the norm, and sort of upsets of things going like up and down somewhat rapidly or somewhat unexpectedly. So for some of you, if this is happening in the workplace, it could coincide with sudden starts and stops of different jobs, of having unique job changes or getting involved in unexpected work situations that are sort of unprecedented compared to what you were doing up to this point going into this period. Uranus transits can also indicate disruptions when it comes to the workplace, so like unexpectedly starting a job or getting fired from a job. Uranus transits through the 6th can also pertain to health issues. So there can be unexpected things coming up with respect to your health and physical constitution, and having to deal with or address different things that come up as Uranus is going through that house. And some of these things may be creating tensions this year with the communication sector of your chart and the other third house things. So that's a little ambiguous, but one of the reasons why I bring it up is because we're going to start an eclipse series. We've actually recently already started an eclipse series where the eclipses this year are going to be bouncing back and forth between your 6th house in Taurus and your 12th house in Scorpio. And this is one of the last things I wanted to mention. So there's 4 eclipses this year, and they're going to keep bouncing back and forth between your 6th house and your 12th house. So the first set of eclipses is late April and early May, and the second set of eclipses is late October through early November. So this is taking place in your 6th and 12th house. The 6th house, as I said previously, is primarily health and work. And the 12th house, though, is a little bit more tricky. Traditionally, it can have to do with things like enemies or people that you don't get along with. It can pertain to long-term ailments or sometimes like mental health. The 12th house can also pertain to seclusion and isolation and this feeling of needing to pull back from the world a little bit. So I think what part of this is that for you guys with Sagittarius rising, the eclipses over the past year and a half or almost 2 years now have been in your 1st house and your 7th house. And so there's been a lot of relationship activity through the eclipses in your 7th house. There's been a lot of development and growth in terms of your sense of selfhood and your personality from the first house eclipses, but those have been more social type eclipses happening in the social houses, which has been having you form a lot of different types of relationships and like interact with other people a lot. But what's happening this year with the eclipses moving into this axis is that this tends to be, especially the 12th house, tends to be a little bit more reclusive and more about pulling back a little bit and being a little bit less social, but instead seeking regeneration, both physically and mentally, through isolation and by sometimes pulling back into yourself in order to find yourself again and to sort of recharge your own spirit. Maybe one of the themes during the course of this year. So sometimes people try to address physical health things that may have come up or that may have been putting off for a while that they've needed to address but have just been not getting to it. Those can sometimes be things that you need to start addressing when 6th house eclipses start taking place. Additionally, when 12th house eclipses start taking place, that can be needing to address sort of more like mental health issues that you've been letting go. Other possibilities is the 12th house can sometimes have to do with what they traditionally said was enemies, but it can also just be people you don't get along with or people that undermine you. Now, sometimes people that undermine you are people that just like don't like you for some reason because there's certain people in our lives that we just don't get along with sometimes. Other times the 12th house can have to do with the ways in which we undermine ourselves in different ways or do things that are within our own best interest. So one of the things you might think about this year is like, are there any things that I could do better in order to help myself out and not undermine myself either deliberately or accidentally? That's one of the sort of like meditations that you might want to have this year in order to see if there's any things that you'd really like to improve about yourself that have been long-running things that you've always meant to improve, but have never focused on or spent a lot of time doing. And this might be a good idea to do that, or a good time to do that. All right, so those are some of the eclipses that are taking place during the course of this year. The last thing that I wanted to mention and talk about a little bit here is there's going to be a Mars retrograde transit in the second half of this year in Gemini, which for those of you with Sagittarius rising, Gemini is your 7th house of relationships. So Mars is going to go retrograde in your 7th house of relationships. As I said earlier with the Mars transits, sometimes this can be just like putting a lot more work into this area of your life of relationships. So this transit starts August 20th, as soon as Mars goes into the sign of Gemini. But then there's this real turning point and real period of intensification around October 30th. And that's the point at which Mars does this U-turn and it stops in the middle of the sky or in the middle of the zodiac. And then it does a U-turn and it starts walking backwards and retracing its step for several weeks. So a Mars transit through the 7th house can be putting more emphasis on relationships, more energy. Sometimes there can be issues that come up in relationships that require us to take decisive action. And so sometimes during the course of a Mars retrograde transit in the 7th house, you may find yourself having to take decisive action when it comes to relationships where you feel like things have gotten bogged down and somebody needs to do something, and it will end up being left up to you to make a choice about how to go forward and what direction to take. So that's in some of the more constructive scenarios. Some of the more challenging scenarios are typical Mars type things that have to do with like conflict in relationships or strife in relationships or having a falling out or a severing or separating type experience when it comes to relationships. So sometimes people can experience a breakup if they're already in a long-term relationship, if there's certain things that they've needed to work out that haven't been worked out up to this point. You could hit sort of a wall or a breaking point where you just can't proceed further and decide to go your own separate ways. Sometimes Mars transits through the 7th house can bring a Martial type figure or a Mars type figure into your life who sort of cajoles you into doing something or heading in a specific direction that you might not have gone otherwise. So sometimes that can be a little bit irritating, but ultimately necessary because it's pushing you in a direction that's probably ultimately important for your overall growth, even if it's not something you initially sort of appreciated when they were playing that role at first. Overall, though, this is a transit that, while it gets going in the later part of 2022, it doesn't really wrap up until the early part of 2023. So we're going to see a continuation of this story that just starts in the second half of 2022. But it has to do with just, for some reason, the heightened focus and activity on relationships in the second half of the year. All right, so I think those are the main things that I wanted to touch on. Let me just go through and make sure that there weren't any graphs that I didn't show or things that I meant to mention or talk about. There's the Venus retrograde, Saturn square Uranus. All right, I think that's it. So those are the major themes that I wanted to touch on for your horoscope and your year ahead forecast for 2022. So good luck, and I'll see you again in 2023. All right, that's it for this horoscope forecast for 2022. So, as always, this was just a general forecast that focuses on some of the broad outlines of the year ahead. So, if you'd like a more detailed analysis of some of the general transits this year, then be sure to check out our year ahead forecast for 2022 that we released in December. Additionally, for a more detailed analysis of your chart, you might want to get a consultation with an astrologer because they can look at it in much more detail than I can go into here in just a general horoscope. Alternatively, or better yet, you could also learn how to read your birth chart and transits on your own, which would allow you to pinpoint some of the dates involved with much more precision and exactness. So, if you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then you can get a copy of my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune. And in this book, I reconstructed the original system of Western astrology and recovered some techniques that we had lost many centuries ago. So, with this book, I sort of teach you how to read a birth chart and how to use different timing techniques in order to determine when different things will happen during the course of your life, or in some instances during the course of a single year, as I've attempted to do in this horoscope forecast. So the book is available on Amazon as well as in other fine bookstores everywhere. I also teach an online course on ancient astrology, which has over 100 hours of video lectures. It shows hundreds of different example charts in order to show you how the different techniques work in practice. And it really gets into details that I couldn't go into as much in my book, even though the book is very big. In the course, I actually get into a lot more example charts, which really gives you a better hands-on experience of how to use astrology to read birth charts in practice. So you can find out more information about that at courses.theastrologyschool.com. And finally, I also recently released my 2022 electional astrology report, where I went through the year and I picked out some of the most auspicious or lucky dates with one lucky date or electional chart for each of the next 12 months. So these are useful for starting different types of ventures and undertakings using the principles of electional astrology. The report is also available at courses.theastrologyschool.com. All right, so that's it. So thanks for watching. Good luck in 2022, and may the stars be ever in your favor. Special thanks to all the patrons that supported the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, thanks to the patrons on our producers tier, including Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Sumo Kopic, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Morgan McKinsey, and Kristen Otero. If you like the work that I'm doing here on the podcast and you would like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. And in exchange, you'll get access to bonus content such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the month ahead forecast each month, access to a private monthly auspicious elections report that we put out each month, access to exclusive episodes that are only available for patrons, or you can also get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast. The main software we use here on the podcast to look at astrological charts is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available at alabe.com, and you can use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we use a similar set of software by the same programming team called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is available from astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount on that as well. Also, special thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is available at mountainastrologer.com, the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs, available at honeycomb.co, and the AstroGold Astrology app, which is available for both iPhone and Android at astrogold.io. There are also two major astrology conferences happening this year. The first is the Northwest Astrological Conference, happening May 26th through the 30th, 2022, near Seattle, Washington. Find out more information at norwac.net. And the second is the International Society for Astrological Research Conference, which is taking place August 25th through the 29th, 2022, in Westminster, Colorado. And you can find out more information about that at isar2022.org.